G'day folks, and welcome to part 2 of this rules primer for A Time for Trumpets. Now each day this game begins with a pre-dawn turn, then 2 daylight turns, and then a final evening turn. And each of these turns consists of what's called a mutual player segment, then a German player segment, a US player segment, and then a final brief mutual end of turn segment. Now in the first video I covered the foundations of unit information and command. In this second part, I'll fill in the details on the rest of that mutual player segment, and I'll work through this procedurally, explaining things as I go. So by the end of this video, we'll have most of the information about that mutual player segment done and dusted. So first of all, you check for reinforcements. You can prepare these now, but I'll cover details on how they arrive later in another video as they activate with their HQ activities. Secondly, you check for ground conditions. So this may be stated as fixed on the turn record track, so you check that, or it may be variable, in which case you roll on the ground conditions table, fairly straightforward. You then check the turn record track to see if you must determine atmospheric conditions. If it tells you to roll, you simply roll on this atmospheric conditions table for each German army. If no roll is required, the conditions are clear for all German armies. Starting on the 18th of December, on pre-dawn turns, you make what's called a headquarters freshness determination. This involves consulting the freshness determination chart. You'll memorize this fairly quickly, checking what markers a headquarters has and updating their status accordingly. Now, the freshness status of each headquarters affects units in that formation. Fatigued headquarters calls a -1 effectiveness rating or morale penalty for all units in that formation, and it will take 2 turns of resting to recover from that fatigue. An HQ that is exhausted must rest for the entire day, and the ER or morale rating of all units in that formation is 0. While headquarters retain full movement under those conditions, all other units in the formation get half movement and they can't voluntarily attack. And if forced to counterattack or refight and engage result in combat, exhausted units withdraw instead. If they can't withdraw for any reason in that case, they're eliminated instead. So it's quite a bad condition to be under. Step 5 in the segments of play is the air segment. And let's talk about aircraft as part of this. Aircraft serve a couple of different purposes in A Time for Trumpets. First of all, I'll acknowledge that from the 23rd of December, there are Allied strategic bombing attacks, which use a special bombing table. It can cause rubble to be placed in various locations around the map. Before that, starting on the 17th of December, there are tactical aircraft available to both sides. You roll on the aircraft table and allocate these to core headquarters. They become attached to those core HQs. Once there, they can be allocated to missions. Fighters and bombers may both strafe, interdict during the mutual aircraft segment, and both may provide ground combat support during a combat segment. Fighters only may intercept any of those missions. Now, on strafing interdiction missions, German and US aircraft are placed within 20 hexes of the core HQ that they were assigned to. British air can be placed anywhere west of the Ourthe River from Liège to Romans. The hex chosen will then be really the center of their strafing attention, and you will pay attention to the 6 hexes also surrounding that target hex. Now, there's an order of placement in section 5.72 of the rules to be mindful of, and in fact there's an order of sort of interception, an order of ground support. All these things have a special order that you'll need to follow, but with that done, fighters then have the opportunity to intercept those strafing units, and again there is an order of interception. With each opportunity, the attacker basically begins this interception by rolling a die for the attacker, adding their air-to-air attack factor, and then rolling a separate dice for the defender, adding the defender's air-to-air defense factor. The high roll here basically wins. Now, if the interceptor wins, the strafing aircraft aborts their sort of mission and is removed. If the strafing aircraft wins this initial attack, nothing happens. Then you kind of flip this around. The defender rolls the dice. They roll 1 die for themselves, counter-attacking the interceptor, adding their air-to-air attack factor, and they roll a separate die for the interceptor, adding the interceptor's defense factor. And in that case, if the interceptor is lower, they abort their interception mission. Their they're removed. It's possible for that both aircraft could abort, or that none could abort, or just one. If they abort, whether the interceptor or the strafing aircraft, they're basically removed from their mission. If only the strafing aircraft aborts, the interceptor remains kind of active and available. They return to the core HQ, and they remain available for later interception or even ground support later on. If only the interceptor aborts, then the strafing mission continues. And if none abort, well, the interceptor returns to the core HQ, they become available, and the strafing mission continues. After all interceptions are done, you work through all these, strafing missions may commence again in a certain order. Now, for each mission, you may target any or all hexes in or adjacent to the target hex. Focusing on these one at a time, all units in your hex, basically targeting one hex, are targeted. You roll on the strafe attack table and the AA return fire table, applying die roll modifiers, implement the results, which on basically the strafe table is either no effect or target disrupted. On the AA table is either no effect or an abort. If the strafing unit aborts, they're spent and remove, and they strafe no more for that turn. If they survive that particular segment, they remain where they are and slow enemy movement according to the air interdiction chart. That all happens during the mutual aircraft segment. But as I said, aircraft can be used during ground combat support later on. An aircraft can only support one ground combat, and then it is spent and removed. And again, it's similar in terms of range. German and US aircraft place 20 hexes within their core HQ. British, anywhere west of the Earth. And of course, the combat they support must include a unit from the core that they are attached to. Fighters can again intercept this ground support, again within the ranges of German, US and British air, and it follows the same interception sequence that I just discussed. If that ground support is successful, if they're not aborted basically, that ground support aircraft provides additional combat factors and column shifts on the CRT for that combat, which importantly is on player card 3A. It took me a while to find that. And the effects may also be modified by weather and or the presence of AA units in the target hex. Now, moving on beyond that, steps 6 to 8 of this segment revolve around checking command, and I've covered that in the first rules primer, so I won't go back over that again. You basically check command, make sure everyone's in command. If they're not, out of command markers are placed. Step 9 is the supply segment, and it's pretty similar to that command segment. This is determined on pre-dawn turns only, starting on the 17th of December, and German fuel shortages, which I'll talk about in a moment, begin on the 19th of December. Basically, headquarters must trace supply to a supply source, and the status of that supply lasts throughout the entire day. That supply path is blocked by enemy zones of control, which cannot be negated by friendly units. It can be a path of basically infinite hexes from the HQ to a supply source. It cannot, that path from the HQ to supply source cannot pass through rubble, nor across unbridged or blown bridge rivers, streams, lakes. It follows roads only. This is slightly different to command, where the command path is tracing hexes across any terrain, lakes, whatever. This supply path to HQs must follow roads, not in enemy zones control, not through rubble and so forth. If an HQ is out of supply, you mark it as out of supply. And you need to follow the same pattern for each HQ. Basically each headquarters traces supply independently. An army headquarter, for example, may be out of supply, and the echelon units attached to that army thus out of supply, but their core may be in supply, and the units of that core may then be in supply. So as I said, if an army, or if any headquarters is out of supply, the attached echelon combat units are also out of supply. If a headquarters is in supply, they can trace that path to a supply source. You then trace supply to their subordinate combat units, counting hexes, not movement, using the command range of that HQ. Now that path is a little different. It may go through any terrain and rubble, not just roads, but through any terrain, but it still cannot cross unbridged rivers, streams, or lake. Now, if for any reason there is no path or it's beyond that command range, and keep in mind at divisional level, command ranges are typically a bit lower, then those in particular units are marked out of supply. Now, the same rules apply for most headquarters and units, but Allied field artillery groups headquarters are independent as well. They must draw supply themselves. The effects of out of supply are again quite punitive. For headquarters, horse artillery and foot units, their movement is not reduced. They retain full movement despite the lack of supply. Armoured fighting vehicles, trucks and cross-country units, and they're typically marked with little wheel markers below their NATO symbol, they have their movement halved, rounded up. Out of supply units cannot construct defensive position. Engineers can't build bridges, they can't dismantle bridges, they can't ferry units across fords, they can't blow bridges. Artillery units that are out of supply cannot fire, but units that are out of supply may receive artillery support and aircraft ground support if they're in command. Now notice the distinction here. I mentioned out of command units in the first primer can't receive this support. It's different if they're out of supply. They can still receive that support if out of supply, if they're in command. Attacks that include out of supply units suffer a column shift left. When defenders include a unit that is out of supply, there's a column shift to the right, similar to in command, and quite punitive. Now, it's possible that a unit can be both out of supply and isolated. If headquarters and units cannot trace a path of any length to a supply source, they are deemed isolated. After the 18th of December, there is a risk they may surrender, and they make a roll for this. The units that are isolated may retreat if attacked. Isolated artillery, however, there's special withdrawal rules for artillery, but if they're isolated, they may not be withdrawn. Step 10 is the US supply by air phase. And basically from the 23rd of December, Allies can supply their units from air. This is fairly easy. You drop an air supply marker on an Allied HQ, spend an aircraft from the core HQ or the force being supplied, and that supplied headquarters can supply 20 combat units from any formation, not just their own, throughout the day. So that's pretty generous and flexible with that air supply. Step 11 then, following on from this, it refers to German fuel shortages, and you make these checks. And basically from the 19th of December, German panzer divisions and brigades may suffer fuel shortages. They roll during this point in the sequence of play, referencing the fuel shortage table to determine each headquarters status. Units that are marked low fuel may only move 1 hex and are limited to a 1 hex advance after combat. They can cancel this, however, for their headquarters and its formation by spending a captured fuel counter or a fuel unit. So step 12 enables the Germans to then spend their fuel units to cancel the effects of those fuel shortages. So how do they get these fuel units and how do they spend them? Well, there's a few ways. First, Liège and Namur serve as US supply dumps. If the Germans can capture those cities and then trace supply to those cities, they don't suffer fuel shortages. In addition, there are smaller fuel dumps throughout various locations. And if the Germans capture those locations, they capture a set number of fuel units according to the special chart. However, the number of fuel units available in certain towns decreases over time. In addition to that, they may also have a chance of capturing fuel whenever they enter other towns not listed on that chart. They simply roll 2 dice, and on a 2 or a 3, they capture 1 unit of fuel. 5 towns along the border are exempt from that rule. Now, when captured in these towns, the fuel counters move as trucks with 8 movement points, and there is a risk they can be recaptured from the Germans by the Allies. So the Germans need to protect these fuel units. At any time, a fuel counter can be spent then within the command of an HQ to remove that fuel shortage for a panzer formation for 1 turn, or for Camp Grove Piper, Krockenhausen, or Führer Escort for an entire day. There's also the possibility that the Germans can gain fuel barrels, which they kind of store in reserve, and they can use those anywhere for the same effect. So that whole sequence of spending fuel to cancel that comes straight after that supply and fuel shortage check phase. That then brings us to the end of the mutual player segment. Fire rules primer 1 and 2, they are pretty much most of the rules, and again, skimming the surface, there's a lot of detail. There are some exceptions that I haven't covered, but with this done, that should be enough to get you started with working through that mutual player segment. There is no air on the first turn, so you don't have to worry about that. No fuel shortages on the first turn, so you've got a nice, easy introduction to the first scenario.